I want you to try a little thought experiment with us right now. Just, picture your kitchen.
Yeah, just visualize it.
Right. So let's say there is a bright red tomato sitting right there on the counter, and you can see it perfectly. If you walked over, you could feel the smooth skin, with absolute, unwavering certainty that the tomato is a physical object existing in the real world. But what if I told you that the very moment you turn your back, or the moment you just close your eyes, that red tomato completely and utterly ceases to exist?
I mean, it sounds like an absurd provocation.
Exactly.
It sounds like something a person who has completely lost touch with reality would say. But the foundation of that statement actually comes from some of the most rigorous, cutting-edge cognitive science being done today.
And I don't mean that as some late-night dorm room philosophical riddle.
Yeah.
I mean it as a hard Darwinian mathematical fact.
Yeah, we are looking at the work of Donald Hoffman. He's a cognitive psychologist who has built this incredibly detailed mathematical and evolutionary framework that essentially suggests everything you are perceiving right now is a grand deception.
Which is just wild. And just so you, the listener, know what we're getting into today on this deep dive, we aren't just going to debate the existence of vegetables.
No.
We're using Hoffman's translated texts right alongside decades of actual medical research to hunt down the answer to what scientists call the hard problem of consciousness.
Right. And to do that, we are going to look at some truly terrifying historical surgeries that literally trap two separate minds inside a single human skull.
Oh, man, that part is so crazy. And we're going to look at modern laboratories where researchers are using lasers, like actual lasers, to hack into the brain and manually overwrite terror with pure joy.
Exactly. And finally, we are going to walk step by step through a scientific proof that argues the reality you are navigating every single day is, well, nothing more than an evolutionary fiction designed to keep you alive.
The through line connecting all of this is the physical meat of the brain, right?
Yes.
And that incredibly frustrating, seemingly impossible gap between the biological machinery and the subjective feeling of being alive. So, okay, let's unpack this.
Because to really understand how wild this gets, we can't just start with abstract math, We have to start with a scalpel.
Right, a very literal scalpel. Let's rewind to February of 1962, out in California. We have these two neurosurgeons, Joseph Bogan and Philip Vogel.
And the medical community at the time had a rather colorful nickname for them, right?
Yeah, they called them the West Coast Butchers.
Which is rarely what you want to hear your neurosurgeon called right before you go under the knife.
Seriously, I'd be running out of the hospital. But, I mean, to be fair to Bogan and Vogel, they were dealing with a level of desperation that is hard for us to fully conceptualize today.
Yeah, that's true. They had a patient, a man named Bill Jenkins, who was in his late 40s, and Bill suffered from a form of intractable epilepsy that was just utterly destroying his life.
Right, he was experiencing what neurologists call drop attacks.
Exactly. And a drop attack isn't just a tremor. It isn't an aura.
No, it's a sudden, total, catastrophic loss of muscle tone combined with a massive neurological short circuit.
Right. So imagine you are just walking down the sidewalk, maybe holding a cup of coffee, or you're crossing a busy intersection.
So living your life.
Yeah, and without a single fraction of a second of a warning, your entire nervous system essentially crashes. Your legs just give out completely, and you plummet to the ground like a stone.
Which is terrifying. Patients with this condition frequently suffered horrifying traumatic injuries, right?
Oh, absolutely. Fractured skulls, shattered teeth, broken limbs.
And in 1962, the pharmaceutical options were basically useless for this specific extreme severity. So Bill Jenkins is living in a state of constant suffocating terror.
Yeah, he can't drive a car. He can't hold a job.
He can't even stand in his own kitchen to make a sandwich without the risk of suddenly collapsing face first into the counter.
Right. His life is just an agonizing waiting game for the next attack.
And that level of suffering is what pushed Bogan and Vogel to propose a surgical intervention that sounded, frankly, borderline barbaric.
It did. But to understand their logic, we have to look at how an epileptic seizure actually moves through the brain.
Okay, let's break that down.
So, the human brain is a galaxy of roughly 86 billion neurons. Half of them are in the left hemisphere, half are in the right hemisphere.
And these neurons communicate through electrochemical signals.
Right. A seizure is essentially an electrical storm, a massive pathological surge of energy.
So an electrical storm starts somewhere in the brain. Say, a tiny cluster of malfunctioning neurons in the left hemisphere just starts misfiring.
Yes. And normally, that storm would just spread locally. It would cascade through the trillions of local connections on the left side.
But the reason it causes a full-body drop attack is that the storm crosses over to the right hemisphere, right?
Exactly. And it does this via a very specific anatomical bridge.
The corpus callosum.
That's the one. The corpus callosum is a dense bundle of nerve fibers. It contains about 200 million axons.
Okay, 200 million.
And its entire job is to act as the primary communication highway between the left and right halves of your brain.
Wait, let me put those numbers in perspective for a second. You have 86 billion neurons total.
Right.
43 billion on the left, 43 billion on the right. But the bridge connecting them only has 200 million axons.
Yes, relatively tiny.
That's like having two sprawling, futuristic megacities right next to each other, but the only way to get from one to the other is a single two-lane dirt road. It's a massive bottleneck.
That is a perfect way to visualize it. It is a profound structural bottleneck. And Bogan and Vogel looked at that bottleneck and realized it was their only tactical advantage.
Because if the electrical storm starts in the left megacity, it has to cross that dirt road to destroy the right megacity.
Exactly. So their surgical plan was shockingly simple. They decided to cut the road.
They literally took a scalpel, went into a living man's skull, and sliced the corpus callosum completely in half.
Yeah, they did.
I mean, it's like trying to stop a computer virus from spreading from Europe to America by diving into the Atlantic Ocean and physically severing the transatlantic internet cables with a pair of bolt cutters.
It's an incredibly blunt force, brutal approach.
Yeah. You are intentionally trapping the violent electrical storm in one half of the man's brain, basically sacrificing that hemisphere to save the other one.
It was incredibly risky. I mean, they had absolutely no idea what separating the hemispheres would do to a human being's personality, their memory, or even their basic ability to function.
But they did it anyway.
They did. They performed the corpus callosotomy. And the medical outcome, strictly from a neurological standpoint, was an unmitigated triumph.
Wow. So it actually worked.
It worked perfectly. The drop attacks stopped. Over the next 10 years, Bill Jenkins only had 2 generalized seizures. He essentially got his life back.
That's incredible.
Other patients underwent the same procedure and started going to baseball games, getting jobs, living normally. Bogan and Vogel went from being called butchers to being hailed as absolute pioneers.
But the reason we are talking about Bill Jenkins today isn't because they cured his seizures, is it?
No, it's not.
It's because of what scientists discovered when they started testing the minds of these split-brain patients after they healed.
Right. The surgery stopped the electrical storm, but it also permanently stopped all communication between the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain.
The megacities were completely isolated from each other.
Which brings us to Roger Sperry. He was a neurobiologist who ended up winning the Nobel Prize in 1981, specifically for his work with these exact patients.
Because Sperry realized that this surgery had inadvertently created like the most profound psychological experiment in human history.
Exactly. He wanted to know what happens when the left hemisphere literally does not know what the right hemisphere is doing.
Okay, walk us through Sperry's experiment, because the physical setup of this is super crucial to understanding how bizarre the results are.
Yeah, the setup is key. Sperry used a device called a tachistoscope, and this essentially allowed him to flash images on a screen for just a fraction of a second, about 1/10 of a second.
Okay, so really fast.
Very fast. And this timing is vital. It's so fast that the patient's eyes do not have time to dart around and look at different parts of the screen. They have to stare straight ahead at a little cross in the center.
Because if your eyes move, the visual information gets scrambled across both hemispheres, right?
Exactly. Our visual system is wired in a very specific crisscrossed way. If you stare straight ahead, anything in your left visual field is sent exclusively to the right hemisphere of your brain.
Okay.
And anything in your right visual field is sent exclusively to the left hemisphere of your brain.
Got it. So Sperry has the split brain patient staring at the center cross.
Right. And he flashes a slide for 1/10 of a second.
Mm-hmm.
On the left side of the cross is the word key. On the right side of the cross is the word R-ing.
Okay, so the right hemisphere, which controls the left side of the body, sees the word keyway. And the left hemisphere, which controls the right side of the body, and crucially controls speech, sees the word awing.
Exactly.
Now, if you did this to me, my left and right brain would instantly trade text messages across the corpus callosum, stitch the 2 words together, and I would just say, I saw a key ring.
But in the split brain patient, the transatlantic cable is cut. There is no text message.
Right.
Right hemisphere sees key. The left hemisphere sees arn. They are completely physically isolated. So Sperry asks the patient, what did you see?
And the patient answers using their mouth. The speech center is in the left hemisphere. The left hemisphere saw Arn, so the patient says ring.
Exactly. And if Sperry asks, are you sure? Did you see anything else? The patient will confidently say, no, just the word ring.
Wow.
Because the left hemisphere is telling the absolute truth as it knows it. It has zero awareness that the word key was ever on the screen.
This is where the experiment goes from, like, interesting biology to a full-on Twilight Zone episode. Because Sperry doesn't stop there.
No, he blindfolds the patient. Then he brings out a hidden tray with a bunch of random objects on it. A pencil, a spoon, a keychain, a ring, a key.
Just a bunch of junk.
Yeah. And he tells the patient to reach out with their left hand and grab the object they just saw on the screen.
Okay, keep the wiring in mind here.
Right.
The left hand is controlled by the right hemisphere.
Right.
The right hemisphere, which cannot speak, saw the word key.
Yes. So the patient's left hand reaches out, feels around the tray, bypasses the spoon, ignores the keychain, touches the key, and decisively picks it up.
So picture this. You have the blindfolded patient sitting there holding a key in their left hand. And Sperry asks, what are you holding in your left hand?
And remember, the speech center, the left hemisphere, has to answer. But the left hemisphere didn't see the word key. And it cannot feel what the left hand is holding because the sensory information from the left hand goes only to the right hemisphere.
So the left hemisphere is completely blind to this event.
Completely blind. So the patient says, I don't know. Sperry pushes them. Take a guess. The patient starts guessing randomly. A spoon. A pencil. They have absolutely no idea what their own hand is holding.
But the real kicker is when Sperry takes the blindfold off.
Oh, yeah.
The patient looks down at their own hands. In their left hand, they are holding a key.
Right.
And Sperry asks a very simple question. You just told me you only saw the word ring, so why did your left hand just pick up a key?
Now, if the brain were just a simple computer, it might throw an error code or just say, I have no idea, but that is not what the human brain does.
No, it does something way weirder.
The left hemisphere looks at the key in its hand, realizes it has absolutely no logical explanation for why it picked it up, and in a fraction of a second, it fabricates a lie.
It confabulates a plausible story to cover up its ignorance.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The patient will say something like, oh, I picked up the key because I was just thinking about how I lost my car keys this morning.
It's just wild. The left brain is seamlessly, effortlessly lying to itself to maintain the illusion that it is in complete control of the body.
Yes. It has no idea the right brain is operating completely independently with its own memories and visual experiences.
So Bogan and Vogel didn't just stop a seizure. By cutting that bundle of nerves, they literally split a human consciousness into two separate, parallel minds operating inside the exact same skull.
It absolutely forces a total reevaluation of what a person actually is. Roger Sperry concluded that the subdominant right hemisphere is a fully conscious entity.
Which means you have two distinct streams of awareness existing side by side.
And they don't always get along.
Oh, right. The physical altercations are just wild. The source material notes a patient whose left hemisphere, which controls the right hand, would start buttoning up a shirt.
And immediately, the left hand, controlled by the right hemisphere, would follow right behind it and angrily unbutton the shirt.
They were fighting. Or like the right hand would pull out a cigarette and light it, and the left hand would snatch the cigarette out of their mouth and crush it in an ashtray.
It reveals that the separate hemispheres can have completely different desires, different preferences, and different goals.
They're different people, essentially.
There was one famous case where a patient was asked what he wanted to do for a living. The left hemisphere, using speech, stated it wanted to be a draftsman.
Okay, sensible.
But when they put a pencil in the patient's left hand and asked the right hemisphere to write down its career goal, it wrote out that it wanted to be an automobile racer.
This pushes us into deeply, deeply uncomfortable territory. Because V.S. Ramachandran, who is a brilliant neuroscientist, actually tested a split-brain patient on their religious beliefs.
Yes, this is a legendary case.
He asked the left hemisphere if it believed in God, and it said yes. It was devoutly religious. But when he tested the right hemisphere, it turned out to be a staunch atheist.
The implications of that single patient are staggering.
Staggering is an understatement. I mean, if I am that patient and I get hit by a bus tomorrow, who goes where?
Right.
Does my left brain go to heaven and my right brain go to purgatory? Did Bogan and Vogel literally take a surgical steel scalpel and slice a human soul in half?
It is the ultimate nightmare for theology, isn't it? But it also isolates the core mystery for biology.
Because if your beliefs Your desires, your career aspirations, and your religious convictions can all be physically divided by cutting a microscopic wire of meat.
It proves that consciousness is inextricably bound to physical matter.
Which brings us to the terrifyingly massive question that philosophers have been banging their heads against for centuries. We just proved that physical meat creates a feeling.
Right.
But how? I mean, how does wet biological tissue generate a subjective experience?
This is what we call the hard problem of consciousness, a term coined by philosopher David Chalmers.
Okay, let's get into the hard problem.
To really grasp why this problem is so infuriating, let's contrast a human being with a completely inanimate object. Let's take a rock. If you take a rock and a human being and you drop them both off the top of the Leaning Tower of Pisa, they're both subject to the exact same physical laws of the universe.
Gravity affects them equally.
Exactly. They both have mass, they both have a specific velocity, they both have spatial coordinates as they fall.
But the rock is just falling. It doesn't care.
Right. The human being is falling, but they are also experiencing the pure, sheer terror of falling. They are feeling the physical sensation of vertigo.
Maybe they were simultaneously tasting the lingering flavor of the garlic bread they had for lunch.
Yes, they are having rich, vivid, subjective experiences that simply do not exist in the rock.
And beyond sensory experiences, the human has what philosophers refer to as propositional attitudes.
Which are our internal states of belief, desire, and wonder. Think about your daily life, you know. You desire to go on a vacation to Tahiti. You believe that buying a plane ticket will get you there.
You wonder why your best friend hasn't returned your text message. And those attitudes aren't just abstract poetry. They dictate physical reality. Because if I want to go to Tahiti, that internal desire will literally cause my physical fingers to type a credit card number into a keyboard.
Exactly. My subjective feeling moves physical atoms in the real world.
But here is the paradox that creates the hard problem.
The categories of physical science and the categories of subjective experience are utterly incompatible.
They just don't mix.
In physics, we measure things. We measure mass, velocity, electrical charge, spatial dimensions. But how do you apply those measurements to an experience?
Right, like what is the mass of vertigo? Does the taste of garlic bread have a velocity?
Exactly. What are the precise X, Y, and Z spatial coordinates of your wonder about your friend's unreturned text?
It sounds like a joke. It's like asking, what is the temperature of the number 7? Or trying to measure the sadness of a movie using a radar gun.
That's a great analogy. The tools we use to describe physical reality completely break down when confronted with the reality of our own minds.
And the greatest minds in history recognized this profound disconnect, didn't they?
They did. Back in 1714, the German philosopher and mathematician Gottfried Leibniz came up with a brilliant thought experiment to illustrate this.
Oh, Leibniz's mill.
Yes, known as Leibniz's mill. Leibniz was actually a pioneer of early computing. He built mechanical calculators, so he was very open to the idea of complex machinery doing cognitive tasks.
Right. But he argued that mechanism could never explain feeling.
Exactly. He said to imagine you could take the physical machinery of the brain and blow it up, expanding it until it was the size of a massive windmill.
Okay, so imagine walking through the front door of this giant mechanical brain. You were standing inside it, looking around.
What do you see? Leibniz argued that all you would ever see are gears pushing against other gears, levers pulling levers, mechanisms grinding against mechanisms.
Just a bunch of moving parts.
You can map out every single physical interaction perfectly, but nowhere in those spinning gears will you ever find a thought.
You will never find a gear that contains the color blue, or a lever that contains the feeling of love.
The mechanism only explains movement, it never explains perception.
And then, fast forward to 1869, and you have Thomas Huxley.
An English biologist who understood the nervous system better than almost anyone of his era.
And he throws his hands up in defeat.
He really did. He said that the fact that consciousness can arise from irritated nerve tissue is as entirely inexplicable as a magical genie appearing when Aladdin rubs his lamp.
He literally likened the biological basis of consciousness to a fairy tale. That's how stuck they were.
And in 1890, the great American psychologist William James looked at the exact same problem and stated it bluntly. Motion becomes feeling.
He saw it as a transition that human logic simply cannot penetrate.
Moving atoms somehow magically turn into a subjective emotion.
And this isn't just an old, dusty problem. Even in 2005, Science magazine published an issue listing the 125 greatest unanswered questions in all of science.
Number 1 was, what is the universe made of? Which makes sense given dark matter.
Right.
But the second greatest unsolved mystery in the universe was, What is the biological basis of consciousness?
So we have this massive gaping hole in our understanding of reality. For centuries, philosophers have said it's impossible to solve. So what did modern neuroscientists decide to do? Did they just give up?
They did the exact opposite. They pivoted.
Okay, how so?
The modern scientific establishment essentially decided that if we can't solve the deep philosophical why of consciousness, we are going to completely ignore it for now and focus aggressively on the where.
If we can't figure out why a gear creates a thought, let's at least find the exact gear.
Exactly. And the vanguard of this new aggressive biological approach was a group that sounds like they belong in a spy thriller.
The Helmholtz Club.
Yes. The Helmholtz Club was a small, highly exclusive group of neurobiologists, cognitive scientists, and physicists who met monthly in Irvine, California.
And they kept their meetings relatively secret, largely to protect the privacy of one of their most prominent members, right? Francis Crick.
Yes. Crick is, of course, universally famous for co-discovering the double helix structure of DNA in 1953.
Sure.
But in his later years, he turned his formidable intellect away from genetics and directly toward the mystery of consciousness.
And Crick had a specific philosophy for how to tackle this, which he called the astonishing hypothesis. And honestly, it is astonishing just in how cold and reductive it is.
It is very reductive. He essentially wrote that everything you consider to be you, your joys, your sorrows, your memories, your deepest ambitions, your sense of free will, your personal identity, is nothing more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells.
You just a pack of neurons, that's it.
Crick and the Helmholtz Club were highly motivated by the history of biology. Before DNA was discovered, many scientists believed in vitalism.
Right, the idea that living things contained a magical, non-physical life force.
But Watson and Crick obliterated vitalism. They proved that life is just a mechanical, physical process written in a 4-letter chemical code.
So the Helmholtz Club wanted to do the exact same thing to the soul.
Exactly. They wanted to find the double helix of consciousness. They wanted to find the exact biological mechanism that generates the mind, proving once and for all that it is purely physical.
And their strategy for doing this was to launch a massive hunt for what they called the NCCs, the neural correlates of consciousness.
Right. A neural correlate of consciousness is defined as the minimal, precise neural activity that is directly and invariably tied to a specific conscious experience.
So, like, if you taste an apple, what is the exact minimum cluster of neurons that has to fire for you to experience the sweetness?
Yes. And to find these NCCs, they threw every piece of modern technology at the human brain. Functional MRIs to track exactly where oxygenated blood is flowing.
EEGs measuring electrical voltage on the scalp.
Microelectrodes actually inserted into the brain to listen to the specific popping sounds of individual neurons firing.
And this technological assault yielded some incredibly precise maps, didn't it?
It really did. Let's look at the experience of color, for instance. Researchers pinpointed a very specific cluster of tissue in the temporal lobe known as the V4 area.
Okay, the V4 area.
We know this is the NCC for color perception because of what happens when it breaks. If a patient suffers a stroke that damages the V4 area in their left hemisphere, they develop a bizarre condition called hemiochromatopsia.
Hemiochromatopsia, meaning exactly half of their visual world completely loses its color.
Yes. If you hold a bright red apple in front of that patient and they stare right at the center of it, the left half of the apple will look vibrantly red.
Right.
The right half of the exact same apple will look completely gray, like a black and white movie.
But the source text points out that you don't even need to wait for a stroke to prove this connection. Scientists can artificially induce this using a machine called TMS.
Transcranial magnetic stimulation.
Explain TMS.
TMS is a remarkable tool. You place a powerful electromagnetic coil right against the patient's scalp, directly over the V4 area.
Okay.
By pulsing a strong magnetic field, you can essentially induce an electrical current in the brain tissue below, temporarily suppressing the activity of those specific neurons.
So if you point a TMS machine at my left V4 area and turn it on, the color will literally drain out of the right side of my vision in real time.
Yes, you will watch the red apple fade to gray.
And the second they flip the magnet off, the red floods right back in. It's like having a dimmer switch for the concept of color.
And it works the other way, too. If they calibrate the magnet to stimulate the V4 area instead of suppressing it, the person will suddenly experience chromatophenes.
Which means they will see vivid, hallucinatory halos and blobs of vibrant color floating in the air.
We can literally pump color into a human being's consciousness or siphon it out just by waving a magnet over their skull.
It undeniably proves that conscious experience is anchored to specific physical locations. And we see the exact same thing with the sense of touch, right?
Yes. Going all the way back to 1937, a neurosurgeon named Wilder Penfield mapped out a strip of tissue across the top of the brain called the postcentral gyrus.
During brain surgeries, with the patients wide awake, Penfield would take a tiny electrical probe and just tap different spots on this gyrus.
And he realized he was essentially playing the human body like a piano. He touches 1 millimeter of tissue, and the patient says, "I feel a tingling in my left thumb."
Wow.
He moves the probe a tiny bit, and the patient says, "Now I feel a tapping on my cheek." He mapped out exactly where every body part lives in the brain's sensory landscape.
But the map he drew, which is often called the sensory homunculus, is deeply distorted, isn't it?
Highly disordered. Because the brain doesn't care about the physical size of a body part, it cares about sensitivity.
So the lips, the tongue, and the fingertips have massive tracts of brain real estate dedicated to them, while the middle of your back has almost none.
Exactly.
But the wildest part of Penfield's map is how the body parts are arranged next to each other. It's not top to bottom like a normal human.
No, the area that processes the feeling of your face is located right next to the area that processes your hands.
And honestly, it's actually kind of funny. The area that processes sensations from your toes is crammed right next to the area that processes sensations from your genitals.
Which leads to a fascinating, somewhat amusing side note in neurobiology. V.S. Ramachandran, the same scientist who studied the atheist believer split brain patient, looked at that map and proposed a neurological theory for why foot fetishes exist.
Right, because the toe neurons and the genital neurons are sitting right next to each other in the physical meat of the brain. So Ramachandran theorized that a foot fetish might just be a simple biological hardware glitch.
A little bit of electrical cross-wiring between neighboring brain regions.
It is a brilliant example of how profoundly our biological architecture dictates our psychological reality.
It is.
And that realization that our psychology is strictly bound to biological switches leads us to a terrifying next step.
The hacking step.
Yeah, because we know exactly where the switch for color is and exactly where the switch for toe sensation is. Can we just hack the system?
The answer is yes.
Can we bypass therapy and philosophy and just start chemically and optically rewriting human experience?
We can, and researchers already are. We are moving from mapping consciousness to actively manipulating it.
And a profound example of this is the work of Meryl Kint, right, a clinical psychologist in the Netherlands.
Yes. She has developed a radical protocol for treating severe arachnophobia, the paralyzing fear of spiders.
Now, a severe phobia isn't just being startled by a bug. It is an overwhelming, irrational neurological cascade driven by the amygdala, the fear center of the brain.
Exactly.
So how does she hack a phobia?
She uses a two-step biological hack targeting the mechanism of memory. Step 1, she forces the patient to sit in a room with a live tarantula and touch it.
Which is obviously terrifying for the patient.
It is, but it is mechanically necessary. By forcing the encounter, she fully activates the specific neural correlates of consciousness associated with that fear.
The entire phobia network in the amygdala lights up and becomes biologically active.
Right.
It's like taking a book off a dusty shelf in a library and opening it up on the desk. You have to open the memory to access it.
Precisely. Once the book is open, she administers a specific drug called propranolol.
Which is a beta blocker, right?
Propranolol is a common beta blocker normally used for heart conditions. But Kind uses it because of a secondary effect. It severely disrupts a process called memory reconsolidation.
Okay, let me make sure I understand this. When I remember a traumatic event, my brain doesn't just play a video.
No.
It actually has to chemically rebuild the memory, resave it, and put the book back on the shelf.
That is exactly how it works.
Oh.
Recalling a memory makes it temporarily unstable. The brain must synthesize new proteins to lock that memory back down into long-term storage.
And propranolol blocks those specific proteins.
Exactly. So the patient touches the spider, feels the absolute terror, and then the drug prevents the brain from saving that terror back into the hard drive.
The emotional weight of the memory is chemically deleted.
And the results are like magic. The patient comes back the very next day, they look at the tarantula, and they feel absolutely nothing.
The fear is just gone. The switch was flipped and the wire was snipped.
That is chemical hacking.
Yeah.
But the next step in this field makes the propranolol experiment look primitive. A researcher named Christine Denny at Columbia University is using a technology called optogenetics to literally play the emotions of mice using lasers.
Okay, we need to dive deep into how this works because optogenetics sounds like absolute science fiction. You are controlling a living mind with a beam of light. How is that physically possible?
The mechanism requires intense biological engineering. First, Denny takes a mouse and modifies its genetic code.
Okay.
She uses a viral vector to insert a specific gene borrowed from a type of green algae. In the algae, this gene's job is to produce a protein that reacts to sunlight.
So she puts algae DNA into a mouse brain.
Yes. Now, in the mouse, this gene is engineered to sit completely dormant in the brain's neurons. It does absolutely nothing until the mouse is injected with a chemical arming switch, a drug called tamoxifen.
So you have a mouse with dormant algae genes in its brain.
Right.
You inject it with tamoxifen to arm the system. What happens next?
Denny places the armed mouse into an environment that is pure paradise for a rodent. It's a cozy, dimly lit box filled with soft bedding, little toys, and nooks to hide in.
The mouse explores, and it is incredibly happy.
Yes. Because it is experiencing joy, a specific, distinct network of neurons, the NCC for happiness, begins firing rapidly.
And because the tamoxifen is in its system, those currently firing neurons are targeted.
Exactly. The tamoxifen allows the active happy neurons to suddenly express the algae gene. Those specific neurons embed the light-sensitive protein into their cell walls.
Wow. So the mouse's unique pattern of joy is now biologically tagged with a light receptor.
She basically painted a microscopic target exclusively on the neurons that make the mouse feel safe.
That is wild.
Once the tagging is complete, the tamoxifen wears off and the system locks. A few days later, Denny takes that same mouse and drops it into a terrifying environment.
So a totally different box.
It's a hard plastic box, flooded with bright, harsh light with nowhere to hide. Mice are prey animals, so this environment triggers absolute panic.
Right, and the mouse freezes in sheer terror, heart racing, waiting to be eaten.
But then she turns on the laser. She has a tiny fiber optic cable implanted into the mouse's skull. She fires a specific wavelength of blue laser light directly into the mouse's brain. The light bathes the tissue.
And the normal neurons ignore it, right?
The normal neurons ignore it. But the tagged happy neurons, the light hits those algae proteins and it forcefully, artificially blasts those neurons into firing.
She is manually overriding the mouse's reality.
Yes, the mouse is standing in a terrifying, exposed box. But the moment the blue light hits its brain, the biological switch for joy is forced on.
Wow.
The mouse instantly stops panicking, it relaxes, it starts grooming its whiskers, it happily wanders around this horrifying box as if it's walking through a meadow.
Its internal subjective experience has been completely decoupled from its external reality by a laser beam.
Exactly, and the second she turns the laser off,
The light disappears.
the forced firing stops, and the mouse immediately drops back into a crouch, frozen in absolute terror.
Turn the laser back on and it's happy again.
On, off, terror, joy. She is flicking the switch of consciousness like a light bulb in a living room.
That is staggering. It proves that Francis Crick was right on some level. You are just a pack of neurons. If a laser can turn terror into joy, then the physical mechanism is undeniably there.
It is undeniably there.
But here is the massive twist in our deep dive. The source material argues that despite all these incredible hacks, despite the fMRIs and the optogenetic lasers, the Helmholtz Club completely failed.
They did. We still have no idea what consciousness actually is.
How is that possible?
It is the great paradox of modern neuroscience. We are getting incredibly good at hacking the machine, but we are no closer to understanding the ghost inside it.
Right.
To understand why, the source text provides a brilliant analogy. Imagine you are studying a train station. You notice a very reliable pattern. Every single time a massive crowd of people gathers on platform 3, a train arrives 5 minutes later.
Okay, you have discovered a perfect correlation.
Yes, you can even hack the system, you can watch the crowd, and perfectly predict the train.
But the crowd doesn't cause the train to arrive.
Exactly. Finding the neural correlates of consciousness is exactly like finding the crowd on the platform. It tells us where the connection is happening.
We know the V4 area is correlated with color. We know the tagged neurons are correlated with joy.
But knowing where the crowd gathers tells you absolutely nothing about how a steam engine works or why the train schedule is what it is.
So by all our technology, we do not possess a single scientific theory that explains how physical matter can literally be a conscious experience.
Think about it mathematically. Physics is built on predictive laws. If I know the mass of a star and the velocity of a comet, I can use an equation to predict exactly when that comet will orbit the star.
But we have zero equations for feeling.
Zero. The text uses a great sensory example. Think about the sharp, distinct taste of basil. Now contrast that with the blaring, high-pitched screech of an ambulance siren.
Right, totally different experiences.
If consciousness is just brain activity, there must be a mathematical law that dictates why one specific pattern of sodium and potassium ions moving across a cell membrane creates the taste of basil, and why a slightly different pattern creates the sound of a siren.
But those equations do not exist. We can't even imagine what an equation bridging those two realms would look like.
Every single physicalist theory of consciousness eventually relies on a miracle.
Yeah, it's like setting up this massive, intricate Rube Goldberg machine. The ball rolls down the ramp, hits the domino triggers a catapult, the catapult hits a switch. But there is no mechanism to explain how that final physical switch suddenly transforms into the subjective feeling of being in love.
The final step is literally magic.
So we can erase spider phobias, we can laser a mouse into happiness, but we are fundamentally clueless as to how the actual machinery of feeling works. Why are we failing so badly?
Well, the text offers two possibilities. The first one is from Noam Chomsky, and it is a massive blow to the human ego.
He suggests a theory called cognitive closure.
Yes. Chomsky argues that we might just be biologically incapable of solving the problem. Think about the cognitive limits of other animals. You can spend 10 years trying to teach a golden retriever how to solve a calculus equation, and it will never happen.
Right, not because the dog is stubborn, but because its brain physically lacks the conceptual architecture required to understand advanced mathematics.
Exactly. Chomsky is saying that human beings are essentially dogs trying to learn calculus when it comes to consciousness.
Just like a rat is cognitively incapable of navigating a maze that requires it to understand prime numbers, Homo sapiens might simply lack the biological hardware needed to conceptualize how physical matter generates subjective feeling.
It's a hardware limitation.
It is a humbling proposition. But Donald Hoffman, the author of our source text, completely rejects Chomsky's pessimism.
He does. Hoffman says we aren't too stupid to solve the problem. We are just trapped by a false assumption.
False assumptions are the bane of problem solving. To explain this, the text brings up a classic psychology experiment known as the candle problem.
Right, the candle problem.
Imagine you are led into a room. There is a corkboard on the wall. The researcher hands you a candle, a box full of thumbtacks, and a book of matches.
And your task is to attach the candle to the wall in such a way that when you light it, the wax won't drip onto the table below.
Now, most people fail this test miserably.
They do. They try to take a thumbtack and push it directly through the thick wax of the candle into the wall, which just shatters the candle.
Or they try to light the candle, melt a puddle of wax onto the wall, and stick the candle to it, which inevitably falls down.
They fail because of a cognitive block called functional fixedness. When they look at the box of thumbtacks, they automatically, unconsciously assume that the box has only one possible function in the universe to hold the tacks.
Right. They are blinded by a false premise about the object's nature.
The only way to solve the puzzle is to break that premise. You have to realize the box is an independent tool.
You dump the tacks out on the table. You use one tack to pin the empty cardboard box directly to the corkboard. And then you place the candle inside the box, using it as a little shelf.
The problem is easily solvable, but only after you discard your unquestioned assumption.
So Hoffman asks, what is the false assumption in neuroscience? What is the box that we are refusing to empty out that is making the hard problem impossible to solve?
And his answer is the foundation of this entire deep dive.
Yeah, the false assumption is the belief that we see reality as it is.
Now, we need to clarify what he means by that, because we all acknowledge our perception is limited. Physics proves we don't see all of reality.
Right. The visible light we see is just a microscopic sliver of the electromagnetic spectrum.
We know we can't see ultraviolet light like bees do. We can't see thermal infrared heat like tit vipers do. And we can't navigate by magnetic fields like pigeons.
Right. Nobody thinks they possess godlike omniscient vision. But we stubbornly, desperately believe that the small sliver of reality we do see is a perfectly accurate, objective representation of the real world. Okay, I have to stop here and push back on Hoffman's behalf of the listener, because my common sense is screaming right now. Let's go back to the very first thing we talked about in the intro.
The tomato.
Yes, the tomato. I am standing in my kitchen. There is a red tomato sitting on my counter. I am looking right at it. If I close my eyes, my visual field goes dark, but I know with 100% certainty that the tomato is still sitting there.
Sure.
And to prove it, I can keep my eyes closed, reach my hand out, and grab it. I can feel its shape. I can lean in and smell it. I can ask my friend to walk into the kitchen and say, hey, is there a tomato on the counter? My friend will say yes.
Yes, they would.
Doesn't the convergence of my touch, my smell, and the independent verification of another human being definitively prove that the tomato is objectively there, existing exactly as I perceive it, regardless of whether I'm looking at it?
It is the most natural, ironclad defense imaginable. Any sane human being would conclude that the tomato's existence, its physical shape, its red color, and its location in space are objective facts of the universe that exist completely independent of an observer.
Right.
But Hoffman argues that this conclusion is not a logical certainty at all. It is a deeply ingrained evolutionary hallucination. And to start dismantling your tomato defense, we have to look at the Necker cube.
You have probably seen a Necker cube in a high school psychology textbook. It's a very simple 2D line drawing of a transparent cube on a flat piece of paper.
Right. When you stare at the center of this flat arrangement of ink lines, your visual system does something remarkable. It spontaneously forces those flat lines into a 3D shape in your mind.
You will see it pop out so that the front face of the cube is pointing down and to the left. Let's call that cube A.
But if you keep staring at it, your brain will suddenly recalculate and the image will instantly flip. Now the front face is pointing up and to the right. That's cube B.
Your brain will toggle back and forth between them, but you can only ever see cube A or cube B.
So here is the question Hoffman asks, and it completely breaks the tomato defense. When you look away from the paper entirely, which cube is actually sitting there on the page? Is it cube A or cube B?
The answer is neither. There is no 3D cube on the paper. There is only a flat arrangement of ink.
Exactly. If you are looking at it and seeing cube A, and your friend looks over your shoulder and says they see cube B, neither of you is lying.
Your visual systems are independently constructing those 3D objects in real time.
But there is no objective public 3D cube waiting there to be perceived. The cube only exists in the exact instant that an observer's visual system renders it. When you close your eyes, your cube ceases to exist.
And Hoffman is suggesting that the red tomato on the counter is exactly like the Necker cube. When nobody is looking at it, touching it, or interacting with it in any way, there is no red tomato. The object we call a red tomato is just the specific 3D icon your brain constructs when it interacts with an underlying reality that we cannot actually see or comprehend.
It sounds absurd until you look at the historical track record of human perception. Our perception has consistently fed us massive delusions about objective reality.
For most of human history, human perception firmly convinced us that the Earth was completely flat. Why? Because when you look at the horizon, it looks flat.
And even after we figured out it was a sphere, we spent 14 centuries locked into the Ptolemaic model of the universe, believing the Earth was the stationary center of the cosmos and the sun revolved around us.
Why did we believe that? Because when you stand in a field, the Earth feels perfectly motionless beneath your feet, and you can literally watch the sun move across the sky.
Our raw sensory perception fed us a massive fundamental lie, and we built entire scientific and religious empires around it.
This historical blindness was brilliantly summarized by the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. He was chatting with a colleague, Elizabeth Anscombe, and he posed a fascinating question.
He asked her, why do people say it was natural to think the sun revolved around the Earth rather than that the Earth was rotating?
And Anscombe replied, well, I suppose because it looked as if the sun went round the Earth.
And Wittgenstein replies with this absolute kill shot of a question. What would it have looked like if it had looked as if the Earth was rotating?
It's a devastating point. If the Earth were spinning, which it is, at 1,000 miles an hour, the visual experience from the surface of the planet would look exactly the same as if the sun were orbiting a stationary Earth.
Our raw perception alone is biologically incapable of distinguishing between the geocentric illusion and the heliocentric reality. It was only through mathematics and eventually Galileo's telescope that we realized our eyes were lying to us.
Speaking of Galileo, he actually figured out the first half of Hoffman's theory hundreds of years ago.
He did. Galileo was the one who realized that secondary qualities like tastes, odors, and colors don't actually exist out in the physical world.
He wrote that they only live inside our sensitive body. If you remove living, conscious creatures from the universe, all tastes, odors, and colors simply vanish into nothingness.
The redness of the tomato isn't painted onto the tomato. The redness is a data visualization generated exclusively inside your brain.
Galileo was right about color and taste, but he stopped short. He still believed that the primary qualities of the tomato, its physical shape, its mass, its specific location in space, were objective realities that existed when no one was looking.
But Donald Hoffman, utilizing the rigorous mathematics of evolutionary game theory, argues that Galileo didn't go far enough.
And this is the climax of Hoffman's work, the mathematical proof. Hoffman states that, based on evolutionary models, the probability that we see reality as it actually is exactly zero.
Not highly unlikely, statistically zero.
And that doesn't just mean we construct color and taste. That means we construct shape, location, mass, and even the fundamental dimensions of space and time themselves.
To understand how he proved this, we have to look at how evolutionary game theory works. Hoffman and his team ran thousands of computer simulations mapping evolution.
They created virtual environments with resources, and they dropped different types of digital organisms into these environments to see who would survive and reproduce.
Right. Let's walk through one of these simulations because the how is the most important part. Imagine you have two competing organisms.
Okay, organism A and organism B.
Organism A is designed to see objective truth. Its sensory system is perfectly tuned to perceive the exact physical reality, the atomic structure, the complex physics of its environment.
Now imagine organism B. Organism B is designed to see fitness payoffs. It doesn't see the complex atomic truth of the environment at all.
It only sees a heavily simplified, cartoonish interface that tells it what will keep it alive and what will kill it. Let's say a predator approaches. Organism A starts processing the precise metabolic state, the complex atomic mass, and the true physical geometry of the predator.
And that takes a massive amount of metabolic energy and computing time. While organism A is calculating the objective truth of the universe, organism B's simplified visual system just flashes a giant 2D red square that means RON.
Organism B immediately runs away. Organism A gets eaten.
In every single mathematical simulation Hoffman ran, across hundreds of thousands of generations, the organism tuned to see fitness drove the organism tuned to see truth into absolute extinction.
Evolution aggressively punishes organisms that waste energy perceiving the complex truth of reality. Evolution only rewards a simplified, reality-obscuring user interface that guides survival behaviors.
Think about the computer you're using right now. If you want to write an email, you look at your screen, you find a blue icon shaped like an envelope, and you click it.
But you know that the blue envelope doesn't actually exist inside the computer.
The reality of the computer is an unimaginably complex array of magnetic voltages, silicon transistors, and lines of binary code flipping billions of times a second.
If you were forced to interact with the raw reality of the computer, if you had to manually toggle millions of magnetic voltages just to send an email, you would never be able to do it. The complexity would overwhelm you.
The operating system hides the complex reality behind a simple, brightly colored 3D icon so that you can actually use the machine.
And Hoffman is saying that space and time are just the computer desktop. The red tomato on your counter is just the blue envelope icon.
The underlying reality of the universe is not a physical room with a vegetable in it. It is something entirely alien, unimaginably complex, perhaps just interacting fields of data or conscious agents.
But your brain can't handle that raw data, so your evolutionary operating system translates the complex reality of the universe into a simple, clickable 3D icon of a red tomato.
You can interact with the icon, you can eat it to survive, but the icon is not the reality.
It is a total paradigm shift. Discarding the flat Earth was a warm-up. Discarding the geocentric universe was a warm-up. Now, to solve the mystery of consciousness, we are being mathematically compelled to discard the very concepts of space and time.
They are not the objective stage upon which the universe plays out. They are merely the format of our specific biological data visualization tool.
We have covered an insane amount of ground today.
We really have. We started by looking at Bogan and Vogel, taking a scalpel and physically slicing a human brain in half to cure drop attacks, proving that a single skull can house two independent arguing minds.
That surgical reality led us directly into the hard problem, the absolute failure of modern science to explain how biological meat can generate a subjective feeling.
We saw how the Helmholtz Club tried to bypass the philosophy by hunting for the biological switches, the neural correlates of consciousness.
We saw how we can use magnets to drain the color from the world, and how Merrill Kint can chemically delete the fear of spiders.
We explored the terrifying reality of optogenetics, where lasers can manually override the consciousness of a mouse, turning terror into joy with the flick of a switch. But we realized that finding the switch doesn't explain the wiring.
Which brought us to Donald Hoffman's realization that we are trapped by a false assumption.
We dismantled the Necker cube, we remembered Galileo's realization about color, and we walked through the Darwinian proof that evolution hides the truth to prioritize survival.
The physical world, we see objects, shapes, space, and time, is a VR headset we are permanently strapped into.
And that leads us to the final, absolute brain breaker of this deep dive. It is the ultimate paradox posed by Hoffman's text, and it is the hurdle that every single scientist and philosopher must now face.
Let's lay it out.
Let's say you buy into everything we just discussed. You accept Hoffman's math. You accept that space and time are just illusions, a biological user interface created by your perception to hide the complex truth and keep you alive.
Okay, I accept it.
Here is the problem. Neurons, the physical brain cells we spent this entire hour talking about, exist inside space and time. They have physical locations, they have measurable mass, they fire at specific chronological moments.
But they're physical objects.
Exactly. So if space and time are themselves merely illusions created by consciousness, how could physical neurons, which rely on space and time to exist, be the things that are creating consciousness in the first place?
It's the impossible loop.
If the physical brain is just an icon inside the illusion, the icon cannot be the hardware running the simulation.
It completely flips neuroscience upside down. The brain does not create consciousness. Consciousness creates the brain as a visual icon.
Wow. If space and time are the dream, the neurons are just objects inside the dream. The dream objects can't be the ones dreaming the dream. It is a stunning
It
realization.
really leaves you with a lot to process.
Thank you for taking this journey with us today. The next time you walk into your kitchen, I want you to look at that red tomato sitting on your counter. Look at its shape, its color, its shadow. Remember everything we talked about today. Then close your eyes and seriously wonder what in the universe is actually sitting there in the dark.